All right, it's a privilege to have Nancy Pearcey here with us. So let me just read. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Surviving Leonardo, Finding Truth and Total Truth. She's a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top apologists in Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent, even. I can't see right now. I need glasses. I'm sorry. We're almost done. Okay. Yeah. This is the first time I've ever worn glasses on stage. I'm sorry, Nancy. This is just inappropriate. Hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. So, with that, let's welcome Nancy Pearcey to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. Appreciate it. This has been a great conference so far. I've met people from so many different countries, and I really appreciate that. I used to live overseas. I lived in Germany and Norway and, well, Switzerland when I was at L'Abri. But I have to tell you, I was a little surprised that you made the breakout session, Love Thy Body, and the whole session, the plenary session, Masculinity. But I shouldn't have been surprised because it turns out that Masculinity, this book has been the most controversial book I've ever written. And that surprised me, right? Because those of you who were here in the last session know we talked about abortion and homosexuality and transgenderism. And this book has proven even more controversial. And so, to my surprise. And so, people's first question is, why did you write this book? So let's start with that. My eye was caught by, let me see if this works now. No, I'm sorry, it didn't. It went 3 slides up. Yeah. I think this is supposed to work though. Okay. Well, anyway, my eye was caught by how it has become socially acceptable to be very harsh against men. So the Washington Post, an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a mainstream publication like that? Huffington Post editor tweeted, #KillAllMen. It was supposed to be funny. Speaking of humor, you can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." And even books have appeared with titles very blunt, like "I Hate Men, No Good Men," and "Are Men Necessary?" And what surprised me is that even some men are attacking. Whoops, wrong way. Some men are attacking. Guys. Men are attacking their own sex. A fairly well-known book author wrote, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer." And you probably saw this one because it was in the news just a few months ago. James Cameron, the director of Avatar, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. And even very young boys are under attack. This was an Australian tabloid that featured this cover with what ideology calls a 6-year-old a potential monster and says we must stop this menace. A psychotherapist who writes for the Wall Street Journal says, "In my practice as a psychotherapist, I've seen an increase in depression in young men who feel emasculated in a society that is hostile to masculinity. Let me give you the survey, 2020. A survey found that half of American men, 50%, agree with the statement, "These days, society seems to punish men just for acting like men." And then there was a larger one, an international study. 24 countries found 60% of men agree with the statement, "Society has gone so far in promoting women's rights that it is now discriminating against men." Now, whether you agree or not, that's a lot of people who think men are getting a bad deal these days. Ironically, this may be one reason that boys and men are in fact falling behind. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education. It starts in kindergarten. They don't have the same fine motor control that girls do, so they can't use the scissors as well. And all the way up through high school, boys are getting lower grades, lower test scores. Universities, did you know that they're now averaging 60% female students and only 40% male students? And the numbers are even lower for how many graduate. But I teach at Houston Christian University. When I came here 12 years ago, we were 70-30. And so we have tried to attract more male students by starting a football team, and opening an engineering school for more STEM subjects. So now we're almost at the 60-40. We're almost at the average. But more women than men are going to graduate school and even professional schools like law and medicine. Books are coming out with titles like "The War Against Boys," "The Boy Crisis," "The Trouble with Boys," "Why Boys Fail." So we're failing to nurture boys, and then we blame them for their toxic behavior. And once they're adults, did you know that men are falling behind on several measures, both relative to where they used to be and relative to women? So, for example, men are more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, to be homeless, to commit suicide, to suffer mental illness, and to end up behind bars. Right? Some 90% of prison inmates are male. Men are even dropping out of the workplace. It's not showing up in the unemployment statistics because they've stopped looking for work. And so the researchers had to dig deeper, and they now tell us that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. That was a bit of a shock, because we all remember what a crisis that was. Even men's life expectancy has gone down. Women's has stayed the same, so it's not a general trend. And one magazine had an article on it saying, "Being male is now the single largest demographic factor for early death." So how do we respond? Let me start with the good news. Cheer you up a little. We've all heard that Christian men are, if anything, exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? That the idea is that any sort of male headship in the home, in the church, turns men into overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs. It was very easy for me to find examples for my book, but I'll just give you one. So this is the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she says, "The theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today." But social scientists were listening to these accusations, and they asked, "Where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data?" So they went out and they did the studies. In my book, I quote about a dozen different studies, and they found that evangelical men who attend church regularly they actually test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. Whoops. And by the way, they're more loving to their wives, and yes, they do ask the wives separately. I have to say that because I actually get pushback on that. "Oh yeah, of course she said she's happy. Her husband's sitting right there." You know? They are more engaged with their children. they spend 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. They actually have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And surprisingly, they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. One of the nation's top marriage researchers who did the largest study on this is a sociologist named Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. To give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. And so this is a quote from a New York Times article. He said, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." They're focusing on the wives, of course, because the assumption is that these males are overbearing and oppressive. No, the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And yes, this got quoted in the New York Times. Wilcox then turns to his secular colleagues, and this is actually my favorite part of the quote. He says, "Academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands." By the way, as some of you are Catholic, they did study Catholics too and found similar results. This is not a pep talk from some religious leader. These are the results of a rigorous empirical testing. These are evidence-based findings, and we should be confident in bringing them into the public square and showing that they totally debunk the secular narratives. That Christianity does have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in the subtitle. But we also should need to bring this into the churches as well, because I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. It's not out there yet. It's not out in the public at all, even in the churches. I had to read academic journal articles to find most of this. But the pushback I often get is, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the world? Right? Haven't you all heard this? I'm doing a lot of podcasts, and some of them are with pastors who say, "I've used that." In fact, in my research, I found that it is one of the most widely quoted statistics by church leaders today. So the researchers went back to the data, and they made a very crucial distinction between evangelical men who actually attend church regularly, who are actually committed and authentic in their faith, versus nominal evangelicals. By the way, my students don't even know what nominal means, so I tell them N-O-M is Latin for name, so it means in name only. And so on a survey, nominal men might check, say, the Baptist box, for example, but they attend church rarely, if at all. Nominal men test out shockingly different. They fit all the toxic stereotypes. They're actually less engaged with their children. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They have the highest rates of divorce, higher than 20% higher than secular couples. And then the real shocker is that they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So to quote Brad Wilcox again, this time from Christianity Today, "The most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestants who attend church infrequently or not at all." And the emphasis on "the" is his. That's his emphasis. The most violent. So it seems that nominal men are men who sort of hang around the fringes of the Christian world, just enough to hear the language of things like headship and submission, but not enough to learn the biblical meaning of those terms. And so what they do is they infuse those words for meanings that they pick up from the secular world. And so this is really the challenge to the church right now. On the one hand, how can we affirm men who are doing well? I mean, the statistics are in their favor. One of my graduate students at Houston Christian University was the head of a women's ministry at a very large Baptist church in Pearland. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so my book says no more scolding. We need to encourage and affirm and support men who are doing well. And let them know that the more closely they follow Jesus, the better husbands and fathers they are. And then we have the challenge of how to reach out to these nominal men who are at the fringes, right? And how can we draw them in and disciple them better to help them to realize that the script they're living out is a secular script and not a biblical one. So what about the secular script? What is the secular script for masculinity? Well, let me start again with good news. A few years ago, an anthropologist conducted the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And what he found is that despite differences in different cultures, all cultures actually share a universal code for manhood. He calls them the 3 Ps, that the good man is the one who provides, protects, and procreates. That is, become a father, right? Build into the next generation. If you're not a biological father, mentor the next generation. So across the globe, men seem to have an innate, inherent sense that their unique masculine strengths, we're not giving them to get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, to care for those that they love. And so this study does give us a better strategy on how to deal with these issues, because men do not respond very well to being called toxic, right? Nobody would. So the better strategy is to ask, how can we tap into that innate sense that they have, what it does mean to be a good man? How can we support and encourage and affirm them in living up to the ideal that they already hold? Now, let me give you another study. This was by a sociologist, and it found that there are actually 2 contradictory scripts that men are picking up today. Now, this is a sociologist who speaks all around the world, and so he came up with an ingenious experiment where he asks young men 2 questions. First, he says, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? All around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that question. They would immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, do the right thing, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And the sociologist would ask, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then the sociologist would ask a follow-up question. He would say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, oh no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. So do you see the conflict here? Around the globe, men do have an innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man, but they also feel cultural pressure to follow the script of the quote-unquote real man, which includes very different traits. And that not all of them are bad. I mean, we do want people to hang tough in a crisis. But if it gets disconnected from the moral ideal, it can slide into things like entitlement, dominance, misogyny, and so on. What we might call the Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast women. In fact, in response to the boy crisis, we are seeing a growing trend of boys now who are reaching out to influencers online influences like Andrew Tate, or let me give you another one in case you haven't heard of him. Myron Gaines has been heralded in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate. So if you haven't heard about him, he's becoming rapidly quite popular. His program is called Fresh and Fit. So, okay, young men know this one. At any rate, his tagline is, "I help men transform from simps into pimps." And he actually wrote a book in which he says all relationships between men and women is basically prostitution. All men are Johns, all women are whores. A former graduate student of mine now teaches in Dallas at high school level, and she emailed me and she said, "All my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook." I said, "Where do you teach?" "At a classical Christian school." That surprised me. So the next question is, where did this secular script for masculinity come from? Many people assume that the negative rhetoric around men started, say, in the 1960s, second wave feminism, but actually it began much earlier. We have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, most men worked with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men really focused on their caretaking role. In fact, surprisingly, most literature on parenting and child rearing was addressed to men, to fathers. Now, if you go into a typical bookstore today, most of them are to mothers. In the colonial era, fathers were just as involved with their children as mothers were. Of course, especially sons, who were essentially apprentices in their father's trade or craft. And even secular historians say masculine virtue was defined as duty to God and man. So how did we lose this concept of masculine virtue? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home, and men had little choice but to follow their work into factories and offices. And for the first time, men were no longer working with their family members, people they loved, then had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men, which was a very different environment, as you can imagine. In the literature of the time, we start to see people protest that men were changing. They were losing the caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming egocentric, self-interested, aggressive, greedy, and acquisitive, again, to use the language of the day, and that they were even turning financial success into an idol. This is when America was beginning to secularize, and so men were essentially turning their jobs into their idol. I was surprised at how many people said that in the 19th century. And this 19th century is when we first start seeing negative language applied to men, and especially to fathers. With fathers out of the home all day, they were not as tuned into the family dynamics. They were not as aware of their children's needs. So already in the 19th century, fathers began to be portrayed as out of touch, irrelevant, superfluous, and incompetent. In other words, the seeds of the Homer Simpson stereotype. That's when that trend began. Father absence especially affected boys. They no longer had a day-in, day-out model of what it meant to be a man, so that a sociologist writes, for the first time in American history, young men experienced an identity crisis. A historian says, boys grew alienated from their fathers and, as a result, from the world of adult males. I mean, girls were affected too, right? But at least they had their mother in the home, still as a day-by-day model. Robert Bly is the founder of the contemporary men's movement. His book was on the New York Times bestseller list for about a decade. And he says, the love unit most damaged by the Industrial Revolution is the father-son bond. And so he calls it industrial fatherlessness, meaning that fathers were technically still in the home, but they were just gone all day. Commentators at the time noticed that boys' behavior was growing worse. They were growing up without their father's supervision. They were becoming wild and unruly and unmanageable. A leading psychologist of the day wrote, "Never has the American boy been so wild as now, and never in the world have so many young cubs been so half-orphaned. Half-orphaned because their fathers were not there, and left to female guidance in family, in school, home, and church." We're so used to fathers being out of the home that today we no longer realize what a shock it was. It was experienced as traumatic. In the 19th century, there was a huge outpouring of books and articles that lamented missing fathers. People felt like the family had been hollowed out. Parents Magazine, 1842. "The greatest source of domestic sorrow is paternal neglect. The father toils early and late and finds no time to fulfill his duties to his children." The president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who some historians say was the most influential woman of the entire 19th century, said father absence was the central problem facing the family. And she wrote, "God is a father. But how many families are there where the prototype of the divine is practically absent from Sunday to Sunday?" The most striking feature of child-rearing manuals is the disappearance of the reference to fathers. This was also the time when American society was growing more secular. After the Industrial Revolution, there emerged these very large public institutions like factories and businesses, financial institutions, universities, and of course the state. And people began to say that that morality had no place in the realm of politics, business, and industry, that the public sphere should be value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, right? Which is what we still hear today. And because it was men who were getting that secular education and working in that secular sphere, they became more secular in their thinking before women did. Here's one historian. By the way, none of these are Christian historians, by the way. But he says, exposed to a competitive, acquisitive economic world, and often to a secular education, many men lost an active religious sense. So this is when the secular script for masculinity really took hold. And in my book, I go through several stages, but the one I like to focus on is the rise of Darwinian evolution. And that was a bit of a surprise, because most of us think that's about science, right? But the social Darwinist said that in the struggle for survival, the men who came out on top were ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and sexually predatory. In an earlier age, Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, but social Darwinism urged men to live down to what they called the beast within. And this is not just historical. Social Darwinism has come back today. It has a new label. It's called evolutionary psychology, but it sends the same message. There's a best-selling book called The Moral Animal, best-selling. And the author says human males are by nature oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pigs. Giving them advice on how to have a successful marriage was like offering Vikings a booklet titled How Not to Pillage. I thought, how does he get away with being so negative? He's more negative than the most, angry feminist. An older book was just reissued that has similar message, Men in Marriage. Men are by nature violent, sexually predatory, and irresponsible. Their greatest yearning is not for wife and family, but for the motorbike and the open road, the male group escape to a primal mode of predatory and immediate gratification. Are you seeing the origin of the Andrew Tate phenomenon? There's a history here. Serious books were written saying, this is what men are by nature, and the Andrew Tates are just popularizing it. The ideas that fuel the manosphere, the red pillars, the red pills, and the black pills, and all the other pills. This is where it comes from. Serious intellectuals write this way. I mean, have you read George Gilder's book? He's a serious intellectual. Let's talk about solutions. If the alienation of young men began when fathers started working outside the home, the long-term solution has to be reconnecting fathers to their sons. One psychiatrist puts it this way: we're not going to raise a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers. Boys who don't have fathers, you probably know the stats. They're more likely to have problems in schools, to run away from home, to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, and to end up behind bars. As this sociologist puts it, boys raised by traditionally masculine fathers generally do not commit crimes. Fatherless boys commit crimes. Did you know that growing up without a father has a greater impact on crime than race, poverty, or education? And today, about 40% of American children are living apart from their natural fathers. 40%, it's the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. What a thing to be the highest on. Let's look at some of the positive data. There was an award-winning 35-year longitudinal study that looked at how parents are successful in passing on their moral, spiritual, and religious principles. And the study found two surprising results. First, having a close bond with the, we skipped one. Oh no, I went the wrong way. There it is. Having a close bond with the father matters more than a close relationship with the mother. And my female students say, well, that's not fair. I said, well, it's a fact. Mothers do have an influence, of course. But if you looked at the stats, if the father is a committed Christian, the children are much more likely to follow him into the faith. Fathers wield influence whether they want to or not. Secondly, though, the relationship with the father must be warm and close and loving. If the father is a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, has perfect theology, but he's perceived as cold, distant, and authoritarian, the kids will not follow him. And another study, I thought this was interesting, that there was a similar study from a purely secular point of view that was looking at how to raise masculine boys. And it found the same thing. It said a father's own masculinity was irrelevant, whether he was more macho or more gentle. It said the closeness, his warmth and closeness with his son was the key factor. So if a boy has a close, warm, loving relationship with his father, he will end up with a secure, stable, healthy sense of masculinity. Now, what about practical solutions? We can't exactly go undo the Industrial Revolution, but can we tweak the workplace so it's more father-friendly? We talk about family-friendly workplaces. Well, often people interpret that as, helping mothers. So that's why I say father-friendly. Are there maybe ways to have more remote work, part-time, hybrid, flexible hours? There was an article, a study done by Harvard. It's not in my book because it just came out. Harvard University found that during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said that by working from home, they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. Isn't that cool? Yeah. And by the way, it was reported in the New York Times, which also surprised me. So men are saying that they would prefer some kind of flexible work hours, hybrid arrangements, and so on. In fact, in one study, it was a meta-study, 70% of fathers said that they would prefer flexible hours even if it meant taking a pay cut. The time with their family was more important. They don't usually say it in the workplace because they're afraid of the stigma, right? That you're not committed enough. But on an anonymous survey, they will say that. Of course, we have to get corporations on board as well. So I did include in my book some quotes from CEOs who said, actually, during the pandemic, we found that remote work works. It works pretty well. So this is a quote from Zillow, the CEO. He said, "We were always a little hesitant about remote work, right? Our bias against working from home has completely exploded. The company was not seeing any discernible drop in productivity." And finally, what about boys who don't have a father? Do you know, policies work for them too. Research has found that father substitutes can have a huge impact. Grandparents, uncles, teachers, coaches. Coaches have a particularly strong influence on a lot of boys, and church youth pastors. What does that mean? That means that toxic behavior in men and boys is a problem that virtually all of us can contribute to solving. We all have a way of a place to have an impact on the boys that are in our lives. Thank you very much.
Nancy, thank you so much. You've really served us well. I read this book, I think 9 months ago. I just thought, oh my goodness, this is such an important topic, because as a pastor, I see so many men in our congregation a little bit clueless on how to be a man and not really kind of walking, stepping back from taking their role as a man and walking with confidence. So I think your book is timely. I think it serves us well, and your talk served us well. We're going to just ask a couple questions. We can't ask questions for too long because we have dinner problems. So we can't feed 500 people quick enough. So, do you have a question? Yeah. All right, come on, Alan.
Yeah, Nancy, just to encourage you as well, I'm busy taking 25 men through your book currently. They actually met this morning, so I sent them a little photo and said, we're with the author herself. But we're about 4 chapters in, and it's been fantastic. Thank you so much. My question is that it's not easy, but it's kind of straightforward with a man who is using and abusing male headship, to actually confront him and say, you've totally missed the spirit of this. Actually, in that group, there's a couple of men who've been deeply convicted that they've actually not been following Jesus as heads of their home, and have been abusing those teachings, and there's been repentance and confession, and that's been excellent.
Wow.
It's a little bit more tricky for men who have been more passive and have felt intimidated, and perhaps have wives who have experienced toxic masculinity, who are like, man, you're not the boss of me. Don't. How would you encourage us to help passive men to be servant leaders in their home?
That is a good question, because I think we put more emphasis on the men who are being toxic. Since you're only 4 chapters in, I will tell you that I do have two chapters on abuse in the book. Since nominal Christian men test out as the most violent husbands in America, clearly I had to address that. Otherwise, it would look like I was sweeping it under the carpet. So I do have 2 chapters at the very end on abuse in Christian homes and how the church can respond more effectively. So those of you who want to read. I wrote it at the right time because up until now, most of the advice given to women, given to couples in crisis, has been the woman needs to change. If she would just be more submissive, if she would be more loving, if she would cook his favorite foods, if she would have sex more often, he will blossom into the man you want him to be, as one pastor put it to a woman who's being abused. And that's not realistic. That's not human nature. Right? If somebody's willing to hurt somebody else to get what they want, that person is a bully. And we know that if you acquiesce to bullies, if you try to appease them, if you try to placate them, that they usually get worse. They escalate. And so fortunately, there are more and more books coming out from a Christian perspective saying that's not the answer. That the answer is what Jesus gave us in Matthew 18, which is if somebody's genuinely sinning, you confront them. And if they don't listen to you, you bring some witnesses. And if they don't listen to them, you bring it to the church. And if they don't listen to them, that may be time for church discipline. So fortunately, there are more and more books, and you find all the best books in those 2 chapters. I made sure I cited them all so that it would be a good resource for people who need books on the subject, and by both Christian and non-Christian authors. But you've got me a little bit, put me on the spot a bit because I didn't really deal much with passivity as a problem. I do mention that there's 2 sides that you can go off the rails. Being overly assertive and aggressive and dominating others versus being passive. But I didn't really deal with it much because I guess because most of the books are written for the other group. Most of the books are written for the people who are being abusive. They're the ones who need help, who go to counselors, who go for pastoral counseling and so on. I really didn't run into very much on what you do if a man is being too passive. The next book. So, yeah, I might not have a ready answer for you right now. I'll think about it, though.
Nancy, thank you for your excellent talk. We're mostly, so there's a room full of pastors and church leaders. What one thing, maybe one thing's unfair, what would be your top things in terms of what can we do in local churches? We represent a broad spectrum, obviously a lot of Americans, I'm from the UK, there's people from around the world. What would you say we should be doing most helpfully in our churches to help counteract what you've been describing?
Yeah, off the top of my head, there's 2 things. I was surprised in doing my research to find out that most churches do not have a men's group. I thought all churches had a men's group. They all have women's groups, but most churches don't even have a men's group. So let's start there. Let's have men's groups in our churches. Let's have a way of mentoring, teaching, nurturing, supporting men. And start with some of this data, right? The data on how Christian men who really live out their faith are much more successful in their marriages and their families. That should encourage men. There is a website called Church for Men, which you might like. It has sort of practical things, and from simple things like have a more masculine decor in your church. Don't have pretty pink things, And so churchformen.com, I think, or .org, I forget, but Church for Men. And it's run by a man who wrote a book called Why Men Hate Going to Church. And it's a good book. And it's not deep philosophical, but it's a good book to get started on why men hate going to church. So that's a good place to start. The second place to start is I would really like to see churches have ministries to fatherless boys. I think it's time for us to start ministries to fatherless boys, to make that a higher priority. to hook boys up with a male mentor, an adult male. And there's talk now. If you want another book that's come out after my book, it's called Of Men and Boys. It's by Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution. And what's significant about the book is that it's the first time a liberal has written on this topic. Somehow caring about boys and men has got coded conservative. I'm not sure why, but if you cared about boys falling behind in school, you were told that you were conservative and you don't care about girls. By the way, girls got ahead partly because we gave them so much support. Title IX, and what was it, 1972, and then 1994 Gender Equity Act poured millions of dollars into development of curricula that was supportive of girls, into equity workshops, into training materials. There's a reason girls pulled ahead. The idea, though, was they thought they would pull girls up to the level where boys were. They had no idea that girls would charge right past. And that's what's happened. Girls have charged right past and are now succeeding, they're succeeding far more than boys. So maybe it's time to have some programs for boys. That's another thing we can do, not just in our churches, but in terms of, working with our communities and our public schools and so on. Are there ways we can support boys? Richard Reeves of Boys and Men, a very secular writer, he even left the Brookings Institution to start his own organization called Association or something, Association for Men and Boys. And so sign up, get his newsletter. They're going to be putting out research on, how we can help boys. But one of his main suggestions is, should we reconsider single-sex schools? Should we sometimes maybe pull boys out? And, girls mature faster. So that's another reason boys feel like they're incompetent and falling behind. It's just a biological difference between boys and girls. So there are ages at which maybe single-sex schools would be good. Well, why not churches? Single-sex groups for boys as well. So I would like to see, all that to say, I'd like to see churches put a higher priority on ministering to fatherless boys.
Nancy, so enjoying this. We experience that the educational system and the opportunities that women are given nowadays, particularly I'm thinking of 20-year-olds, which is a very positive thing, is impacting the way, so it's the feminist kind of worldview, is impacting how they relate to the issue of headship, and they struggle with that. Have you got any comment on that subject and how we help women, as well as men being good men, how do we help women appreciate that? Because I see that there's a kind of, or at least in the churches I'm involved in, there's a push against headship. I'm seeing it as a positive, Christ-like, loving headship. Have you got any comment on that and how we help women as well as men grow positively?
Well, certainly if you give a biblical view, it will be more attractive to women. I actually became more conservative in writing this book by writing the chapters on abuse, because I came to see that we need to acknowledge the differences between men and women. I mean, I still have young feminist students who say, oh, there's no difference between men and women. That's all a social construction. It's time to say, no, there are actual biological differences between men and women. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have more fast-twitch muscles. I had to learn that one. That means they can react more quickly. Because of testosterone, they're, on average, more aggressive and more risk-taking. And if we don't acknowledge that, there will be situations where a woman is in danger because a man is bigger and stronger. If they've been drinking, they're partying, and you're alone in a room with a half-drunk guy, this is dangerous. is you need to acknowledge the differences between men and women so that you put moral guardrails up on that greater strength. On the one hand, you want to say that this is good, men's greater strength is good, but it's also a danger for women. There are some women who I'll give you an example. There was a woman who's was a very well-known liberal writer, Louise Perry. So Louise Perry, she's British. She was known as a very leftist writer, writes for the New Statesman. And now she's become conservative on these issues. And you go, what happened? She worked at a rape shelter. So she was face to face with women who were physically overpowered by a stronger man. And she came to realize we have to acknowledge the differences between men and women for women's sake, to protect women. Because if we don't acknowledge it, we won't put moral guardrails up. And so I would say, for women's sake, we need to acknowledge the differences between men and women. And, and we have to give men something positive to do with their greater strength.
Nancy, thank you so much for your talk. When I read your book, one of the things that most surprised and also dismayed me was the way you described the fact that in Protestant churches especially, if I understood it rightly, there's been a minority of men going back quite a long time, even before, for I think even centuries.
Hold on, it's not coming, your voice isn't coming all the way to the front. So can you...
The fact that in Protestant churches in the West, there's been a minority of men in those churches going back a long time, even, and that seems to be a particular problem. On the other hand, we have all these boys who are clearly drawn to something in models like Andrew Tate and others who've been influenced by Jordan Peterson more positively, I think. And I wonder if you could speak to the missional opportunity. The fact, I lead a church that's mainly young people in their 20s in central London, and we have an imbalance. There are fewer men than there are young women. It's a massive problem when it comes to singleness and the prospect of marrying, and it really hurts me as a pastor to see this and just think, how do we begin to reach boys and young men in our culture and draw them to Christ? And I wonder if if you have any advice or seen good examples of the missional opportunity to begin to turn the tables there and reach men for Jesus.
Let me repeat. Read the book, Why Men Hate Going to Church, and go to his website, Church for Men. But his recommendations are fairly superficial, though they work. I think the deeper issue is we need to teach the cultural mandate. So do you guys know what the cultural mandate is, that term? Theologians use that term. So many men think, when we call them to become Christians, we're calling them to come sit in this church pew, and sing songs. And that's just a little too narrow, right? That's sacred-secular split, right? We're asking them to jump up into the sacred area. But what do you do with the rest of the world? Well, the theologians use the term cultural mandate for the verse in Genesis that says, when God creates human beings, right? He's created the universe, he's created the animals, he creates the first human couple. What is the first thing he says to them? It's be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the highly streamlined language of Genesis 1, we can unpack that, because be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean the family, but anthropologists tell us all the social institutions grow out of the family. Right? So it becomes a clan, a tribe, a village, a nation. And you also need social institutions for purposes like you need a state, you need a school, you need a church, you need a marketplace. And so the calling there is to create all of the social institutions that make up a civilization. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. Right? So again, it usually starts with farming, but mining and mining and technology and inventing computers and composing music. One of my students said, "Oh, come on, composing music." So I said, "I play the violin." What's the violin made out of? Wood. And the bow, horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty you associate with music starts with harnessing the natural resources in creation. And so this is called the cultural mandate because what it says is God's original purpose. Remember, this is pre-fall. He's just created them. He's just telling them, why did I create you? What's your purpose? It's to create civilizations, to create cultures, to make history. And so I think this is a much richer understanding that is especially important for men because it fulfills their drive to accomplish, to achieve, to have an impact. So I think we need to get out of the sacred secular split and show how God's truth is true for the secular, so-called secular realm as well, and that when they are doing their jobs, when they're doing their vocations, when they're building up their community, that's obedience to God because it's obedience to the cultural mandate. And so I think that richer vision is going to attract men, if we can recover the teaching on the cultural mandate.
Nancy, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Can I ask a favor? There's so many churches represented here. We want to do well in raising men that are biblical men walking in the purposes that God has for them, not the toxic version that the world has rejected, doesn't want anything to do with, but men who actually created in the image of God to fulfill their purposes. We want to raise men like that. Would you mind praying for all of our churches? We would really appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord, for bringing people together from the entire globe, people who love you, who want to serve you, and who want to serve their people well. And we pray for this issue in particular, that you would raise up godly men, that you would equip these churches to reach out to men, to craft a message that is particularly geared toward men and to how your word and how your spirit brings out the masculinity, the true manhood, the good manhood in all of us. And we pray for women as well, that we will learn how to support and encourage men. Thank you for the data that we have now, that we can actually go beyond just sort of emotional pumping people up, but we can actually bring them good, solid empirical research, and knowing that following your way, your word, and your teachings will actually make our marriages better, make our families better, and most of all, make our men stronger, better, and more loving in their families and in their churches and their communities. We thank you so much for the power of your Holy Spirit that makes this all possible. And in Jesus' name, we offer this whole conference up to you. Amen. Thank you.